this conference, we're talking about the early church fathers, saying that the early church was the Catholic Church. And I remember reading a Protestant scholar, an article he wrote a few years ago, and he said that the most arrogant thing he thought that a Catholic had ever said, and it was not that our pancake breakfasts are better than their potlucks, hand down. He said the most arrogant thing was to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. Of course, from Cardinal John Henry Newman. It's a great quote.
It's a great quote, yeah. And let me just remind everybody. John Henry Cardinal Newman was a brilliant mind. If you read The Infallibility of the Church by George Salmon, a contemporaneous work by another brilliant mind, you will see that the men of his age respected him and respected his intelligence and his study. So do not underestimate John Henry Cardinal Newman, but also do not forget his history. Because in my opinion, Newman was a tragic figure. He was tragic in the sense that, as I said last time, he well knew that what was proclaimed by the Vatican Council regarding the infallibility of the Bishop of Rome was not the belief of the early church. It was not apostolic. It was simply not commensurate with the history of the church. And he had written against the concept. Once it became the official statement of the church, he submitted himself. And this was one of a number of reasons why he developed what's called the development of doctrine concept. The idea that dogma and doctrine is contained in seed form and then grows into something much larger. And as Salmon points out repeatedly in The Infallibility of the Church, which I'd highly recommend you get a hold of. I would assume about the only way to get hold of it today is in PDF format, but I highly recommend it to you. What Salmon pointed out in The Infallibility of the Church is that this was a fundamental abandonment of the historical field of battle. It was not where Rome had been before. It was not where the Jesuits had been in the Counter-Reformation. This represented a new form of approach where you, in essence, conceded that the now extremely developed concepts of the papacy, Marian theology, these types of things were not primitive because they weren't. The people who desperately, I mean, the term is desperation, latch on to any phrase, any word in the most flowery language and fill it with Marian dogma to go, see, here's something in the 4th century. That means that it was there. No, it doesn't mean it was there. No serious historian operates in that way, but Roman Catholics have to because they can't do serious history on their dogmas because their dogmas were defined by the assertion, such as you have in Satis Cognitum, that this is the universal faith of the church. This is always what has been taught from the beginning, the ancient and universal faith. So what was truly sad and tragic about Newman was that he used that great intellect to then destroy the field that he had made the claim about. To go deep into history is to cease defending history, is what he ended up having to defend. And so, yes, it is arrogant, and it is improper, and you've never heard me say to go deep into history is to be a Reformed Baptist or to cease to be this, that, or the other thing, because the early church had a lot of different perspectives, not on certain issues. There wasn't a bunch of people running around that were denying monotheism or something like that, but there were a number of different perspectives, and there were differences even between some of the Cappadocian fathers, for example. You can detect some differences of emphasis and things like that. So you have to let the early fathers be the early fathers. Rome dogmatically does not allow her people to do that. So it is an arrogant thing, what he said, but there's a background to it that makes it more so. And maybe that's what this guy was referring to.
But I think for our conference, so when you look at the history of the church, Catholicism fully blooms. Now, he took great chagrin at this because this particular scholar was a Protestant church historian. And so you may encounter Protestant friends, maybe have some Protestants here, I hope that we do, who may think that it's arrogant to say, oh, if you just read the church fathers, you'll automatically become Catholic. What about, and there are very good Protestant church historians. I cite several of them in my own works. Jaroslav Pelikan, he was Lutheran, became Eastern Orthodox. J.N.D. Kelly, who's a great Anglican scholar, lots of them. So if you're so confident that the early church fathers are Catholic, why haven't these people converted? And what?
Now catch that, and this is very important. Here are a couple of people that were mentioned there. I didn't grab my Pelican set, but J.N.D. Kelly, Early Christian Doctrines by J.N.D. Kelly, that is very useful. The Oxford Dictionary of Popes, also by J.N.D. Kelly. Really interesting stuff there. Obviously, Roman Catholics would have to take exception to a number of the things that he says for the obvious reason that it's about the popes and therefore errors that popes made and things like that. He didn't mention this one. Peter Lampe's work, Christians at Rome in the First 2 Centuries, I think is really fascinating because this is, in comparison to most things, 2003. I mean, for some people, that sounds like a long time ago. It's not. But what's really important about that particular work is the information that it provides us on the subject of the form of church governance in Rome early on, which was very plainly from Ignatius's letters and from other sources, not a monarchical episcopate. There was no one bishop in Rome. It was a plurality of elders. And that, of course, causes tremendous problems with the Petrine promise and the claims of Rome in regards to the passing on of Petrine authority and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But yes, the thing that I really found objectionable to what Trent Horn said is it's not a matter of, well, why didn't they convert? Why didn't they convert? That's not the point. There are going to be people from all... Well, okay, let me back up. He's talking to people who are assuming that if you study church history, you will automatically convert. And now he's trying to explain why that's not the case. And I just simply say, it's not the case because that's not what conversion is based on. God can use all sorts of things. He can use the consistency of the history of the church. He can use, many things, but that's not what brings about conversion. And when you listen to EWTN, when you listen to a lot of what Catholic Answers does, one of the things that strikes you is when we talk about conversion, we are automatically always talking about conversion to Christ. Most of the time, they're talking about conversion to the church. Now, they would say, well, that's not a big difference. Christ is associated with the church, blah, 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 blah. There is a fundamental difference because we are talking about regeneration. We are talking about a spiritual thing, and they're talking about submitting to the magisterium and to the church and seeing in the church the fulfillment of all these things. That is a difference between us.
I would say is that when people look at the church fathers, there are Protestants who look at them and then, of course, see things in a different way and misinterpret what they say or make an error in their thinking. And that's what I want to point out in this talk today. And Protestants have been stepping up their game.
Now, notice, for Trent, there is only one way of interpreting the early church fathers. Did you catch that? they make mistakes and they miss this and da 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 da. So there is no other way to interpret the early church fathers than what Rome says. Well, that's Rome's claim. He's accepting status cognitum. He's saying, yeah, that's the case. That wasn't in some areas what Lofton was saying yesterday when we played that section from the debate he did with Chris Date. So I'm not sure if that's just a tactical difference or just what.
In this regard, if you listen to debates between Carl Keating and Patrick Madrid in the late 1980s, the early 1990s, you'll hear people getting smashed. They don't even bother touching the church fathers. And Protestants saw a need to do that. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, you see more works coming that try to analyze the fathers from a Protestant perspective. So what I want to offer...
Now, it sounds like we're talking about the same thing, and in a sense we are. The first debates that I listened to were with Carl Keating, Patrick Madrid, Jerry Matics, and Scott Hahn. Okay, they were the big 1989 stars. Okay, and I think it was 89. Might have been 88, but I'm thinking probably 1989 when I started first listening to these particular debates. I can assure you that that Kelly was active well before then. And there were already, obviously, and I don't know, I have not found Roman Catholic apologists as a whole to be all that familiar with scholarly Protestant or Reformed writings from the time of the Reformation and things like that. And so they may not be familiar with Salmon, they may not be familiar with Whitaker, they might not be familiar with Good, they may not be familiar with the Lutheran Chemnitz. These are massive works, multi-volume works, thousands of pages, dealing with the early church and patristic sources and things like that. And so we weren't, there was no, it wasn't like all the Protestants got together and said, we need to start doing something about this. No, I became involved in dealing with Roman Catholicism partly because of online activity. Yes, there was an online before the internet. It was called FidoNet. It was called the BBS system, Bulletin Board Systems. And that was active in the 1980s. And I was active in witnessing to Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. And then we ran into Roman Catholics. And we started having exchanges with Roman Catholics, and that's when we are sent tapes. No links to go listen to something. Something arrived in the mail, and it was a cassette tape. And so I would be literally out. I remember very clearly preparing to debate Tim Staples, for example, on my bike with what was called a Walkman in my back pocket, in my back jersey pocket, and it was yay thick and that big, and it's a cassette tape player. And when the battery started dying, the person would start talking much more slowly. The fun days of the ancient past. Anyway, so I started listening, and this was, this was right at the end of my seminary, and right as 1990, that year was first year I taught church history at Grand Canyon. So I'm studying church history, and I'm preparing to teach church history. And so I'm hearing claims being made that I know just simply don't fit with the facts. And so when we did that debate on the papacy, which was moderated by Scott Hahn, by the way, and I think it was the beginning of the division between Hahn and Matics at that point, because when it was over, Hahn came up to the two of us soon as it was done. I mean, he dismissed it, turned around. He was angry. I've seen Hahn angry a number of times. And he said to me, he rebuked me. He says, you brought up papal infallibility, and that wasn't the subject of this debate. Well, I had once or twice, but the vast majority of my argumentation had not been about papal infallibility, but about interpretation of the Petrine Promise and things like that in the early church. But then, in front of me, and with a crowd gathering around us, he turned to Jerry Matics and he said, and you blew it because you used only Scripture, and you can't do that. And with Protestants gathering around like sharks around a wounded fish, Scott Hahn turned around and stalked out of the building and left Jerry Matics standing there in the midst of all these people who knew that he had just lost this debate, and now they wanted to press their advantage. And Hahn turned around and left him standing there. And I don't remember how long it was after that it was a matter of weeks or months at most. It was not a long time at all before Jerry Matics was no longer with Catholic Answers. And it had only been 18 months earlier. I've got to find my old collection of This Rock. I eventually found online, I found the picture from This Rock magazine, publication of Catholic Answers. Full, it was either the inside front cover or inside back cover. I think it was the inside front cover of This Rock magazine. Full black and white picture, full page, glossy, of Jerry Matics seated on the back of a sort of a pew, and behind him is a church. And the thing was, I was the reason your friends left the Catholic Church, or something along those lines. Because one of the things that Jerry claimed was that he was this great anti-Catholic and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And for years I said, Jerry, could you send me one debate you did as a Protestant against Roman Catholicism? Can you send me documentation about one happening? Any tracts you wrote, booklets? I know you didn't write a book, but tracts, booklets, anything to back up this claim that you make. And he never provided anything. I'm sure he was anti-Catholic as a Presbyterian. He was the first, to my knowledge, ordained PCA minister to ever become Roman Catholic, to my knowledge. So he would have been, quote unquote, anti-Catholic in that way, but in the sense of actually engaging with Rome's apologists and things like that, I, to this day, don't believe that ever really actually happened. But that's how they're advertising it. And I would say within a very short period of time after that debate at City of the Lord is when Jerry was no longer with Catholic Answers. He went out on his own. And you know what? Every time I say that, I'm like, how come I haven't heard anything about Jerry Matics? The last time, honestly, that I heard anything about Jerry Matics, you know when it was? When he was on Jeopardy. He was on Jeopardy about, what? I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago? And he didn't win. So that was the last time I heard anything. I had a friend who had been sort of following him. He'd get sporadic emails. Jerry Matics was the least organized and disciplined person I've ever met. And I've told the story. I'll just tell it and then we'll wrap up. But when he and I debated at a Presbyterian church in Denver, Colorado, on the papacy, over 7 hours. I encourage people, there's no video of it, but it's on sermon audio. 7 hours. The first night was on the New Testament at Denver Seminary. The second night, Presbyterian Church on the early church. And when the second night was over, I had packed my stuff up. I had that same silver case that I used when I debated Mitch Pacwa. I had put my books away, and Rich and I were standing up on the platform, and so there was a 6-foot table over here, and I've got 2 bookcases, book bags sitting on it, and that's it. The chair is pushed in. Over on the other side is Jerry, and Jerry had been out in selling books or something, or out talking to people, and he comes walking back in. Most people have left, and Rich and I are looking at his table, and so that's about that size table over there, I would say. Similar to the one behind me. There was not an open square inch on the top of that table. Books opened, tablets of paper, just everywhere. And then underneath the table on the floor, the only spot that was open was where his feet had been. There's papers and notes and bags and books. Total disaster. Total disaster. Now, part of that was because he was really struggling in that debate. I hit him with so many citations from so many different perspectives from the early church that demonstrated this was not apostolic, this was not what the early church believed at all, that he was just throwing stuff out left and right, and so he was having to dig deep. But that was many moons ago. That was 1993 when we went up to Denver, Colorado, World Youth Day, when Pope John Paul II came. We've been doing this for a long time, and so he says it was early 2000s. No, it started, the pushback started December of 1990. That's when it began. I know because I was there, and I remember it very, very, very clearly.